and welcome to another episode of the Wayfare Recording Podcast. This is episode 3 of our series going over the Podcast Strategy Guide Workbook. If you're jumping in on this episode randomly, just to kind of get a vibe of the show, to get a vibe of who I am for whatever reason, first of all, welcome. And second of all, if you want to check it out and work along with us, you can find a link to download it in the description below or in the show notes if you're listening to this on the audio versions. Otherwise, feel free to like, subscribe, follow, all that fun stuff, all those technical logistics. Whatever, I can bring it up later in the episode too. It's a quick reminder. Anyways, moving on to the main episode. So we are on page 7, and we're going to be on page 7 until page, I'm looking through my document right now, page 9. We're going to go through page 9 and end on that. Podcast format. So what do I mean by podcast format when you check out this book? So podcast format is kind of more like, what's the format of your show in the sense of, are you doing like a monologue? Are you interviewing people? Are you kind of doing something more dynamic, like inserting audio files or using like an interview as the backdrop and you're kind of interweaving it throughout your narrative? And that's usually what we're talking about. We also are kind of asking questions like, what's your intro script? How are you introducing the listeners to your show? What's your exit? Your outro, like, oh, thank you for listening to the show. Be sure to like and subscribe. But it's also as well, like, what's your music? What's the length of the show? And we're not quite getting into like the nuances of like where those pieces lie. That'll be for the next episode. We're kind of just like ideating, what are you saying for your intro? We're ideating what your podcast format is. We're ideating ways to flesh out those ideas from inspirational components. And I can kind of get in the nuance of that in a second. I'm just going to give you a broad stroke as to what that is. So right off the rip, what's your format? Is it an interview? Is it a monologue? Are you storytelling? Are you narrating? What's your format? So since I'm working along with you guys, I got my workbook with you guys right here on my iPad. And so I'm kind of detailing it with you, answering the questions, I guess, with you. And if I were to answer this is a monologue. It's just me talking to you, the listener. You might hear my dog in the background every now and again. Like I believe in the last episode, my dog was sleeping and snoring. We'll see how the editors of the show work on that. But this is a monologue. So, and monologues are just, again, one person talking. There's no other person on the other end except you listening. Interviews are one-on-one, one-on-two, two-on-two. You're just kind of asking questions back and forth. And those are pretty common. If you're listening to some of the bigger shows like, Joe Rogan, those are interview-based. How I built this, that's more dynamic storytelling. That's more narrative. That's more taking interviews and splicing it in throughout. How I built this has Guy Raz kind of giving a backdrop of what the show is and then going into an interview. I'm trying to think of anything else. I think Serial is a narrative based, I believe. Yeah, that sounds right to me. And on the workbook, there's also an other section. Maybe you have something entirely different. Maybe you have something that you're trying new and fresh. Maybe I'm missing something in this list. Candidly, that's probably going to happen. But this is just to identify what your show is. Maybe it's a mixture of both. That could go in the other section. And so after that, I have, what are some podcasts that you draw inspiration from? So I would probably say for this one, my biggest inspiration for this show is, I got two that come to mind. One is both are pretty niche, but one is hyper niche, and the other one is pretty big if you're in the right space. So one is Rob Bell podcast. The way that he delivers his show is very much so interpersonal. He really wants to reflect with you. I get the sense that he manifests you on the other end, that you are really there right next to him. A lot of meditative ideas. And I'm not trying to I guess we're kind of meditating, but it's much more conversationally oriented, which is really nice. It takes a lot of talent, I believe, to do that. I feel like I'm not getting it right with this show, but I hope I'm getting that vibe. The other one is, if you know, there's this guy out there. I think he's out in the New England region. His name is Julian, and he does a lot of deep dives into 2000s. If you know, 2000s emo music. And I enjoy listening to that kind of music. But the way that he presents his show is kind of more of where the inspiration comes from. It's very lo-fi. It's very very stripped down. It's literally, I don't know what he uses for a microphone. You can't really see it. You can see it. You can see mine here, but he uses a webcam. I'm using my phone, and he uses his, I think his computer camera, I believe. I could ask him. I kind of talk with him every now and again, but it's very stripped down, and that's kind of where the idea is coming from. As far as how I present this show. Yeah. So, I mean, when you're going through this, just who are some shows that you enjoy following that really inspire you? I think I could pull something off like that. And if you don't have one, just kind of float around, poke around, take 30 minutes and go on YouTube and just see what resonates with you. Yeah, so the next one is introduction. We're on page 8, by the way. The next one is introduction script and exit script. So these are pretty, I don't want to say they're optional. They are optional. It's your podcast. You can do what you want. But they're pretty important to kind of hunker down and figure out how you want to present it. For this show, I don't think I have an intro, a formal intro and exit, formal intro and outro to the show. I guess for the introduction, I've just been saying hey, welcome to another episode of the Wayfare Recording Podcast. Some people do full on welcome to da 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 da, and you're in this show we do X, Y, and Z, and we talk about this, that, and the other thing. I'm your host, Joe Schmo, and thank you again for listening. And then the music plays, and then you transition to the formal episode. That is one way of doing it, and I do recommend doing that if you're really unsure or you're really uncomfortable with how to present yourself, and you just want to jump right into the episode. I do recommend doing that as an option. But really, the idea for an introduction is to find a way to consistently introduce your audience to a new episode of your show. And because, consistency and familiarity are super important for podcasts. And this is one way to kind of create that consistency. If you're really confident with how you present it, just jumping right in and going for it, great. Your listener will develop that familiarity, and you will develop the consistency, and you'll develop that practice, and perfect. As far as exit goes, the exit script is going to be much more standard. It's going to be hey, be sure to review, and subscribe. It's going to be thanks again for listening to another episode of whatever your show is. But you want to do that. That is the core. It's not the call to action of your podcast necessarily, but it's a core way to ensure that you are doing your part to retain the listener, I guess. So like it's there's partial call to action to it. But it's a way to retain the listener for your show. And you can include your formal call to action. Like, if your podcast is a funnel, I've said in previous episodes that this particular podcast, I don't want to handle it like a funnel, but it is inherently one. Like, if you're listening to this, you're watching this, and you like me, and you like the and you like what we do, and you want to work with us, I mean, this is how you found out. So, that's how it works. But I mean, what the funneling is, or the call to action can be very critical if that's how you're treating the podcast. So, you would say something like, "Hey, thanks so much for listening to another episode of, let's just do this one, Wayfare Recording Podcast. Be sure to like, review, subscribe, share with a friend. And if you like me and you like what we're doing, feel free to reach out. Go to our contact form. I'll have a link below in the description. I'll try to remember to actually do that. But it's something along those lines. Like, you want to make sure that you have I guess I could call it the call to action of the show, but then also the call to action to your operations and what you're trying to get with the podcast. I'm putting a lot of extra thought into it. It's really low stress. Like, just have your call to action and be sure to include liking, subscribing, and sharing. Otherwise, it might be tough for people to find your podcast. So yeah, that's the intro and outro. The last page that we have in this section is on page 9, and that one's going to be going over your target podcast length. How many speakers per episode are you going to have in the show? Do you have music? Do you have music selected? And this one's pretty straightforward, I would say. Music, I'll start with that one. I'll kind of work backwards. Music's pretty tricky. That one I would recommend actually kind of fleshing out with whoever you choose for your producer, whether it's me or someone else. Like, I would recommend talking to them about what their thoughts are. If you work with me, I typically suggest that there are 3 options that you can take with music. There's the royalty-free option, there's the original, and then there's the, and this is kind of original too, but you have the option to make your own if you're talented, if you have a musicality to your skill set, where you can construct one. But the getting an original one, if you're not making it, but you're reaching out to someone, can cost quite a bit. Getting licenses to do music's really tricky. Getting licenses to obtain a song can be pretty expensive most of the time. Sometimes you can just reach out to them and maybe they're like a more indie type musician and they won't mind as much. But it can cost quite a bit of money. And for my suggestion is to go royalty free, at least starting out. I don't recommend switching music up too frequently in a show, but you can. It's your podcast. But going the royalty free option is usually the safest bet. And if you work with me, like I have I have the options to provide you with music, and they totally sound royalty free. They're pretty generic, but I mean, it gets the job done. Because again, you want to do music for, like I said earlier, consistency, familiarity. You want to make sure that you're telling your audience that they are in your show. Like, music is a very powerful tool to indicate that consistency and familiarity with your show. So, and then for the speakers, I mean, how many people are you planning on having on your show? Is it one? Monologue? Is it you? 2 people, is it an interview? 3 people, that can be an interview as well. 4+ is usually if you're doing more narrative-based stuff and you're interviewing multiple people. But just kind of recognizing what your goal is and who you're speaking to. And then lastly, for the target length, this one isn't tricky. I'm just thinking back on a discussion that I had recently with a client. We were discussing what good podcast lengths are for shows. And typically the general rule of thumb is, and this is kind of more on a listener retention and a listener basis, where if you're doing a monologue, about 20 minutes is a pretty healthy length to aim for. Because, listening to one person for just going on and on and on for like an hour and a half can be pretty tiring. It's not a bad idea, especially if you're very much so like information oriented and information forward. But it can be pretty taxing, and you want to make sure you hold on to those listeners, not just for one episode, but keeping them on for more than one episode. And yeah, I would recommend 20 minutes is a pretty good length for that, again, for retention purposes. And if you are doing an interview, 45 minutes is a pretty good number to aim for. 45 to 60 minutes, again, if it's very information forward, those are pretty good numbers to kind of run with. And anything more than that, like, I think it's kind of being more of being mindful about what your show is and what your goal is. Because, like, Joe Rogan does like way longer than that, like 3 hours. And I think he's built pretty good credibility to pull something off like that. But there are also podcasts out there that do like an hour and a half. And, again, if you're information forward, great, go for it. And I think having the tools like, chapters, transcriptions, kind of being able to help the listener bookmark where they are is very helpful if you have a longer podcast. But yeah, a general rule of thumb is 20 for monologue, 45 to 60 for interviews, and kind of aiming for those numbers. But if you want to do longer, that's your show. Go for it. That's great. But yeah, I think that's going to be it for this episode. Just to reiterate, if you guys like what you're hearing, feel free to like, subscribe, share with people that you think would benefit from this show. If you are really interested in following along, again, PDF will be available in the description below this video or associated with the show notes on this podcast if you're doing an audio only listen. And otherwise, thank you so much for checking us out. Until the next episode.